Why did white people win? That is probably the question that came across your mind when you first clicked this video. And as a brown person, it is a question that crossed my mind as well. You see, I'm of Indian descent, but I was born and raised in America. Both these places were once colonized by Europe and have shaped me. And being from lands with two different types of Indians, it naturally made me wonder, how did Europeans from a cold, wet corner of the world manage to spread so far and wide? I mean, look at this map. Europeans have either colonized or influenced almost every country on the planet. How did they conquer so many of the people they met, sometimes even replacing them entirely? It's strange, isn't it? North and Western Europe, regions once written off as muddy, backward, and barbarian, somehow took over everything. Now, these are uncomfortable questions, and a lot of people reach for familiar answers. The Enlightenment, Christianity, innate European culture, naval power, even things like insurance and credit systems. And sure, these help explain a part of the story. But what I want to talk about is something more fundamental. Not ideology, not even technology. What if the real story of European conquest is about biology? And no, I don't mean race science. What I'm referring to is the animals, the plants, and the bacteria that Europeans brought with them, and how it was these European hooves, seeds, and germs, more than swords or sermons, that conquered the world. This is the biological basis of European imperialism. There's an idea that colonization or imperialism is like a white or Western European phenomenon. But this just isn't true. People have been conquering and colonizing other people for millennia, even during the Stone Age, going by fossil records of ritualized mass murders and battles that archaeologists have found. It's a natural human impulse with a lot of unfortunate results. Great empires like the Mongol Empire, the Abbasid Caliphate, or the Mauryan Empire covered millions of square miles and had millions of people from various different backgrounds. The Phoenicians, the Greeks, and even Indian groups like the Tamils and Odiyas would all migrate to places, settle them with their own people, and build empires in areas like North Africa, Southern Italy, and Southeast Asia. Would this be classified as colonization? Maybe or maybe not. The point is that history is complex. However, I do think there are some really exceptional elements to European colonialism. And that's what we're going to explore in this video today. So to firstly understand why European colonialism or imperialism at large was so special, we have to look at some of the early and mostly unsuccessful attempts. By the 900 CE, the Norse from Scandinavia were braving the roaring and tumultuous North Atlantic to establish colonies in places like Iceland and Greenland. Soon enough, they'd find their way to North America as well, a place they called Vinland. Yes, like the villain from Vinland Saga. A guy by the name of Leif Erikson, who also has a day named after him in SpongeBob SquarePants, would sail from Greenland to Newfoundland in modern-day Canada. While their Icelandic sojourn succeeded, the Vikings failed in Greenland and Vinland. Greenland just ended up being too cold and barren. European crops and animals had a difficult time surviving in the desolate land. Their livestock overgrazed the already sparse vegetation, leading to soil exhaustion, which did no favors for attempts at agriculture. Additionally, Greenland was very far from Iceland, and especially the Scandinavian mainland, which meant resupplies were tough, particularly in an era where the Vikings did not have these great ship hulls that later Europeans would possess. Eventually, Greenland Vikings would encounter Inuit groups coming from the north, and these struggling settlers did not have the technology or numbers advantage to hold back the Inuit onslaughts. They were exterminated. Leif Erikson and crew met a similar fate in America. While the land was plentiful and friendly to European animals and plants, Viking sources describe encountering powerful and violent locals called the Skraelings, most likely Algonquin Native Americans. These Vikings were even farther from home base, and similarly to their Greenland cousins, did not have the tech or even numbers to carry those infamous viral Old World diseases that would devastate later Native Americans. What we see from these scenarios is just how important a conducive environment and lack of locals is important for European success. The latter is especially an important facet in our second precursor, the Crusades. With European armies victorious against local Arab armies during the Crusades, many sought out to settle the vaunted Holy Land. The Holy Land, or the Levant, had a very different climate than most of Europe. Some Mediterranean crops and livestock would thrive, but for many northern Europeans, it was a tough place to settle down. The locals were much more numerous and even had advantages in technology in many cases, something that would be apparent with frequent military clashes. Crusaders tried to recreate the feudal European political landscape, but that also hurt their cause of settlement, as they ended up being isolated elites lording over a large local populace. The Europeans would eventually fade away, and essentially become locals as they ended up mixing with the native population. But there is one place that Europeans succeeded before their great migration and conquest of the whole world. Off the coast of Northwest Africa and the Iberian Peninsula are a group of islands, the Atlantic Isles, Madeira, the Canary Islands, and the Azores. These places had similar climates to the Spaniards and Portuguese who would conquer them. The native population in these places was either small or would be destroyed by contact with European diseases. That's how the Guanches would die off in the Canary Islands. European plants and animals would overrun the islands, just as, if not faster, than the human colonizers, totally upending native life. This was a form of terraforming, in a way. Europeans had a massive technology advantage as well, something that would result in the enslavement of natives and importing of Africans. We'd see some of the first New World-style plantations on these islands as Europeans harvested sugar and other cash crops, creating sophisticated and self-sustaining economic networks. The Atlantic Isles would be the blueprint for what happened across the Great Blue Atlantic Ocean, and that would be on a scale never before seen in human history. When we think of colonization, we immediately gravitate towards humans dominating other humans. But colonization is a lot more complex than this. And the scale at which it happened in places like the Americas or Australasia was truly on another level. As Europeans landed in places like modern-day Virginia or the Bahamas, they would set the stage for a new type of conquest, that of the hoof, seed, and germ, via animals, plants, and diseases. Many times before Native Americans even caught sight of a European, they would first see strange animals in the forests or these weird new plants growing in the fields. Sometimes spots would appear on their skin, or they would start coughing in ways never before heard on this side of the Atlantic. For animals, plants, and bacteria travel at quicker rates than humans. Alfred Crosby, a historian who authored the book Ecological Imperialism, called this phenomenon the portmanteau biota. Cool phrase, but what does it mean? It was a metaphor. Wherever Europeans went, they would open their briefcase or portmanteau for fancy people and unleash this powerful biota of old world animals, plants, and bacteria that would serve almost as shock troops for conquest and colonization. Before Europeans would step into places like interior Mexico, the Amazon, or Great Plains, many of these regions would be ravaged by this foreign portmanteau biota. Entire ecosystems, species, and indeed human settlements would be wiped out before European conquerors and settlers arrived due to the drastic and catastrophic changes caused by Old World biota. Let's first examine the hooves, or animals that made such a difference. Europeans brought animals like horses, cows, chickens, and various other domestic animals for consumption and work. These animals were much more robust and advantageous to Europeans versus New World pack animals. Sometimes they brought animals unintentionally, like rats or bees, which would devastate local ecosystems and towns. But the best example we should look at, I think, are pigs. Pigs would bulldoze local flora and fauna. They reproduced very quickly and would go feral just as quick. Bartolomé de las Casas, a missionary who would arrive in the Americas just a few decades after Columbus, noted that there were thousands of pigs in the Caribbean and Mexico, many of these descending from just 8 pigs that Columbus carried on his initial voyage. Pigs would spread across the Americas, ravaging native farms and agriculture, depleted the soil due to their grazing habits, and outcompeted local species integral to native life. They also spread disease to native animals, which further hurt local ecosystems. Natives would eventually hunt the feral variant, but domesticated pigs made European settlements grow large and powerful, for pigs are very efficient sources of nutrition and material for daily life. When it came to plants, Old World seeds found huge success in general. So much so that certain areas of the Americas would begin to resemble Europe as plants began to take over. Plantains would be called as the white man's footprint, as they took over everywhere they went, almost functioning like a weed in the speed of spread. Soil composition would profoundly change, where it and other Old World plants spread, further complicating native agriculture. But I think more impactful than plantains are cash crops like tobacco and sugarcane. Remember how sugarcane changed the Canary Islands? This plant and other cash crops created plantation economies, necessitating slaves and large swaths of forests to be destroyed. That terraforming that happened on the Atlantic Isles was now occurring across the American continent. Natives and imported Africans would be enslaved as Europeans couldn't handle working in the heat. Old World plants made Europeans rich and created an insatiable appetite and feedback loop, pushing them to conquer more land, capture more slaves, and destroying native civilizations. However, I think the most impactful element here is also the least visible: diseases. Diseases like typhus, malaria, yellow fever, and measles would depopulate entire regions. But the most deadly of these would be smallpox. Smallpox would be the first omen of an imminent European invasion, sometimes arriving decades before a single European would even be seen, as it would just take a single contact from a native and European to spread it thousands of miles away as infected natives retreated to deeper and deeper places in the Americas. In Charles Mann's book, 1491, which talks about America during and prior to European contact, he notes some historians estimate that 50 to 90% of the Native American population would die to smallpox and other diseases. Some regions like central Mexico would see their population go from 20 million to 2 million within a century of first contact. In Peru, smallpox annihilated large parts of the Inca Empire before Pizarro and the Spaniards even arrived. Inca Emperor Huayna Capac would die by smallpox, setting off a brutal civil war that primed Peru for conquest. This story repeated itself across the Americas. And the disease itself is also very, very shocking. Smallpox covers victims in pustules that ooze and bleed profusely. People would be extremely disfigured and sometimes even rendered blind by the disease. For people who never saw such a thing, it was like a punishment from the gods, something that profoundly shattered and demoralized their societies. Beyond the physical effect of dead and disfigured bodies, smallpox would scar the soul of many of these civilizations as their healers failed, their kings died, and their gods remained silent to their suffering. This ecological offensive from Europe would break native nations and peoples, rendering them ripe for conquest. These places would become what Crosby calls as Neo-Europes. They would slowly begin to resemble European ecosystems as European animals, plants, and bacteria took over. Local flora, fauna, and humans couldn't resist the march of biology. But it's here where we have to dive deeper and see a distinction between the colonialism of these Neo-Europes or New World, where Europeans settles and replace the locals, versus the type of colonization that happened in the Old World. Europe's ecological imperialism could not work in the same way in the Old World as it did in the New World. There are several reasons for this. Firstly is the natural one, and yes, I literally mean the natural one. These places are also a part of the Old World. They would not succumb to any new infectious diseases or new plants and animals as Australia or the Americas did. Europeans just couldn't overwrite the landscapes the same way they did in Neo-Europes. A big part of this, beyond the resistance to the portmanteau biota of Europeans, was also the sheer density of human civilizations in these regions. Remember what happened during the Crusader period in the Levant? Well, this would replicate across colonized areas where it would be a tiny European elite lording over masses of locals. The Middle East, South Asia, India, and Africa all either had sophisticated civilizations, powerful armies, or familiar traditions of trade and diplomacy to push back against European settlement and replacement. So why then did Europeans not just mix and dissolve in these places like they did during the Crusades in the Levant? Well, here's where we come to those earlier explanations of European success, the non-biological ones. Here's where we have to confront some ugly truths. And again, I'm telling you this as a brown guy who has very negative perceptions of colonialism and what it did to my ancestral land in India. But we gotta speak plain and engage in reality to move on, improve, and most importantly, make sure stuff like that doesn't happen again. The Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and the Industrial Revolutions were a three-step formula for domination. This was European genius in action. Like I said prior, Europe used to be the backwater of the world, especially Northern Europe. It didn't produce any inventions or innovations for so long, not since the height of the Greeks and Romans. But all of a sudden, Europe exploded onto the world. These ideological changes produced scientific and technological changes that gave Europeans an advantage over other lands. Not just that, but Europeans were naturally seafaring people. Surrounded on three sides by water, and even more importantly, areas like the Mediterranean gave a psychological safety net that basically said, hey, there's going to be land and people on the other side. It sounds like such a random thing, but think of what that type of mentality or scenario, how it influences a society. They naturally become more adventurous because they've seen these repeated successes of people going across the ocean and then coming back. They see those successful voyages. They see success in seafaring. With more complex ship innovations also came new financial instruments to fund these very expensive journeys. European banks and guilds created sophisticated systems of credit and financing to compete with each other in building navies and merchant fleets. And again, because of how the Mediterranean always signaled opportunity, there was a bigger appetite for venture capital in a way. This financialization was a form of systemization as well. And that systematic thinking spread across European politics and society. Those that build powerful systems and institutions would win over the other. And naturally, this also extended to military as the professionalism of European armies would overwhelm those across Asia and Africa. European superiority in arms wouldn't just be expressed as brute force conquest though. When the odds weren't in their favor, Europeans would function as something anthropologist Marshall Sahlins calls as a stranger king. A stranger king is a third party that enters the fray between two or more battling tribes or kingdoms. European military and technological superiority would be a valuable asset for native kingdoms, so they naturally would compete over becoming their allies. Thus, Europeans would play off of these dueling dynamics of local kingdoms, supporting and opposing based on strategy. And consequently, local kingdoms would slowly see themselves exhaust in conflict and cede power to this now rapidly rising European contingent. That's how colonialism started in a lot of places, both New and Old World. And finally, I think the most ordinary explanation for the difference between New World and Old World colonialism is very simple. It's money. Profits from the New World were directly invested in imperial ambitions. This is obviously really intuitive, but to give you some hard data, between 1689 and 1888, colonial goods dominated Britain's tax base, accounting for over half of revenue growth. Sugar alone was 1/3 of customs receipts in the late 18th and early 19th century. The resources and revenues from New World colonies would allow the British to be very extroverted in foreign policy, underwriting conflicts like the 7 Years' War, Napoleonic Wars, and of course, colonialism across Africa and Asia. This whole New World colonialism funding Old World conquest story would be repeated for several other European powers. And now that we know all this, what does this ultimately mean for us today? If there's one thing I hope you take away from this video, it's that context is key. Yes, Europe developed very powerful systems in science, finance, and war. But a huge part of the story is also luck. The luck of germs, geography, and timing, of pigs and sugarcane, of ecosystems collapsing before conquest even began. It shows us how deeply randomness shapes history. Think about it. If you told a Roman senator in 37 AD that the wild tribes of Britannia would one day rule half the world, he'd laugh you out of the forum. And similarly, the Rome of the present stands light years away in influence compared to the Rome of the ancient world. Civilizations, nations, and of course, individuals all rise and fall. Time humbles all. And today we see this in motion with the rise, or maybe we should say return, of places in Asia, like China and India, as the world becomes more Asia-centric, rather than revolving around the West. Overall, history provides many great lessons and should be viewed dispassionately. European imperialism indeed destroyed many of the lands they conquered, but these events provide us counsel for the future, warnings of repeating our mistakes, instructions for how to achieve victory, and ideas for how to grow beyond those eras.